right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I just realized that I had left this chapter labeled as Chapter 9. It's actually Chapter 8. The file name is right. Everything on Moodle is right. I just had the title wrong here, so it's supposed to be 8, not 9. The reason is I've taught this chapter for a different textbook or a very similar version of this chapter. And in that class, it's chapter 9. And I actually teach it for 105 at that course. So it's actually kind of nice because there's a lot of things that I had to refer to and sort of re-explain, back when you took 104. But here we get to do it at the same time. So I don't have to, remember back when we talked about these different brain areas because we talked about the brain areas not too long ago. So it makes a really nice transition over. And just a little bit of housekeeping stuff at the beginning. So I was looking at how much content that I have left to cover in the last 2 weeks of course. And I think what I'm going to be able to do, I talked about ending early on Friday. So lecturing for half the period and then giving you guys half the period to go over your midterms. And rather than forcing people to sort of come in for just half a period if they don't care about their midterms, I'm just not going to bother teaching that day. I'm going to cover sort of everything we need on Monday and Wednesday, and then Friday will be sit down, go over the midterms. If you want to go over your assignments, then I'll have those up for you as well. And so we'll have it as sort of a free period where if you want to be here and want to chat about anything, we can. But if you aren't interested, then you just don't have to come. And then for the next week, we'll teach for sure Monday and Wednesday. And then if we're finished on Wednesday, like I think we might be, then Friday will be a review period. And again, optional. So I've made a little bit of a note on Moodle just as our sort of weekly reminder. But I'm also going to send out an announcement that just gives everyone a heads up for that, just in case you don't remember. But then that way we don't have to rush through content. We also don't run out of content. And then it gives you guys the chance to actually look at stuff because I found where I don't have an office, it's very difficult to sit down and go over assignments and papers and stuff unless I end class a little early. So this, I think, is a good option. Okay, and I think that was everything I wanted to do at the beginning. So for our actual content, getting into Chapter 8, we're going to be talking about language and thought. And getting started, this at first seemed like a weird combination. Why would we talk about two very, very different concepts? But in fact, when you start getting into it, and especially the way that our textbook has set this up, we start by talking about language, how we talk about things, and sort of how we acquire language and where it's processed and all of that standard stuff. But then we start getting into talking about how language shapes how we sort of represent information and how that in turn can influence how we think about things. Because how we talk about things can influence our perception of things and how we think about them. So it's kind of a nice transition from sort of learning about how we discuss things and then sort of how we frame things and put concepts together. So this week, we're going to be focusing in on language, and specifically today, we'll talk about some of the base properties of language, the things that language is sort of made up of, and some of the terms that we're going to be using, and then a little bit onto some of the brain areas involved, and then we'll transition over into the acquisition of language, how we develop and sort of bring in language, and then we'll move on from there next week. But we're going to start, as usual, with our big question at the beginning. What is language? And this is another one of those terms that's kind of difficult to put a name on. And I actually find that for this chapter, I can bring in a little bit of enlightenment because I'm sort of one of those outsiders on the edge of the study of language because I study communication in non-human animals. I look at how chickadees communicate. And I've had a lot of issues with terminology because I'm talking about chickadee communication, but I can't imply that their combination of sounds is the same as language, because our psycholinguistics, those who study the psychological aspects of language, and normal linguistics, they don't necessarily like the parallels between human and non-human animal language. So I'll point out a couple of interesting observations from my own experience as we work through this. But if we want a sort of proper definition, we can talk about language as something that consists of a system of symbols and rules. Usually those rules dictate how we can combine those symbols. And combining these symbols can generate an infinite number of possible messages and meanings. And so from that definition, we're actually going to get into, on the next slide, 4 different properties of language. It's symbolicness, the meanings behind it, the semantics, that infinite generativity, being able to sort of make infinite meanings and messages, as well as the rules which structure all of that together. So those are our big indicators of language. And as we said, so psycholinguistics is looking at that psychological aspect of language. So specifically, how do people understand and produce and acquire language? How do we think about language, or how do we think in language? And so we'll start sort of picking away at some of these questions. And so each of our 4 properties, we're going to talk about them sort of on their own. So symbols, what we're using to represent different things. Symbolicness being that there isn't a direct connection between the thing that we're using and the thing that it represents. So I like to use the example of the word dog. Whether it's spoken or written, the word itself doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the animal. We know that the word refers to a dog, but the word doesn't look like a dog, and the word doesn't sound like that animal. We just understand that meaning. And so for that would be a symbolic representation of the animal. And it's a fairly arbitrary representation because there's nothing that connects the structure or the sound of that word to the animal itself. All right, and I suppose I can go into each of these on their own slides, so let's hop over to those. The first slide here is going to be looking at our symbols, which we've started on, as well as structure. So we are using our symbols, and symbols are kind of the same to language as what we've been talking about with stimuli. So a stimulus could be anything, a light, a sound, a temperature, whatever. A symbol, similarly, can be kind of anything. So we can talk about a symbol as a sound, a sign, a gesture, an image. All of those things can be symbolic. And specifically, these symbols are going to allow us to form and then transfer mental representations. And what that means is that we're able to take the things that we're thinking, the ideas and the concepts in our own head, and bring them out into the real world. So maybe you have a dog and you're going to be late getting home from school, so you need to text someone to walk your dog for you. So you can have that sort of understanding that you have a dog, it needs to be walked, and you won't be there. So you can then transfer that information to someone else. You can tell them that stuff that was in your head and put it into their heads. And then they can act on that information. They can walk your dog for you. All right, and then we also have for our structure where we have rules that determine the order of things. And so we can talk about grammar. This is a set of rules that dictates how our symbols can be combined to create meaningful units of communication. How can we stick things together in the correct order? And so if you've learned a language, so it's a lot harder to think about sort of your natural language. If you only speak one language, you haven't necessarily had to think too intensely about some of these rules because you learned it through experiencing it. But for myself, I took French through all of my sort of elementary school and into high school. And then with the pandemic, I decided to pick it back up again. Why not? I'm at home on the computer a lot anyways. Let's refresh French. And so I'm having to sort of test myself on the grammar of the language. I'm having to relearn the fact that a lot of the word orders are opposite what we would use in English. So I've had to adjust to a new set of rules for this new language. And for people who learned English as a second language, they have to deal with the fact that a lot of these rules are more suggestions. They are rules with exceptions. Things like I before E except after C, with an asterisk that there are other exceptions as well. But there's also things like what order do words go in a sentence? How does sort of changing that order change the meaning? And so on and so forth. And these are things that we don't necessarily think a whole lot about, especially after we've learned a language. And so even if we are using these arbitrary symbols, these things that don't necessarily have a direct connection to the thing that they're representing, once we learn them and once we know the rules for combining them, we can start forming and sharing that information that's in our heads and sharing it with others. We can read things on paper, and those things written down are from someone else's mental representations. So we get this transfer of information. And so when we start talking about this information that's being transferred, we might start focusing on the meaning. What is the meaning behind the words and the sentences, the things that are being passed? And we can call this the semantics. So we've already used semantics to discuss meaning in other situations. Same thing here. And the hard part with semantics is that there's a big difference between what we say and what we mean in a lot of situations. And we're going to keep coming back to the fact that there's this disconnect between sort of what we say at the surface level and what we mean at a deeper level. But an example of this is maybe after a hard test, you meet a friend outside the class and you ask them, how did they do? How did that test go? And their response is that they nailed it. And you understand that they mean that they did really well. But if we were literally interpreting their words, you might assume that they had a hammer and nail on the test, which doesn't make sense. So we have this sort of interpretation based on our understanding and based on our social interactions. All right, and we'll come back to that actually on the next slide when we start talking about structure. But first, we're going to briefly discuss our concept of generativity. And so that's that combination of symbols to generate an infinite number of messages that can each have novel meaning. That's basically saying we can combine words in unique ways to make up unique concepts and ideas, things that have never been said or thought of before. So it's really hard to quantify the number of possible combinations because our sentences can be different lengths, involve different words, and be put together in very different ways. So we can say that it's essentially infinite, the possibilities. And that's referring to how generative our language is. We can generate lots and lots of different ideas. And then a really interesting part that goes along with this generativity, with the way that we can put together information and talk about things, our language in particular permits this idea of displacement. So if you think of teaching, say, a toddler how to talk, they're pretty much restricted to talking about the things that they can see and interact with. They're going to point at their food or their drink or whatever, and you're going to talk about the things that are physically present in that moment. But as we acquire language and as our language skills get more advanced, we can start talking about things that are no longer physically present. And we can talk about events that aren't currently occurring. So we can talk about the past and the future. We can even talk about imaginary or theoretical events, and they can all be symbolically represented. So we're not restricted to talking about the here and now. We can talk about something that might happen or something that happened in the past. So we have that displacement of time and even that maybe displacement of reality, something that doesn't exist but theoretically could. And then back to our concept of structure to go along with our meaning, we can sort of distinguish between surface structure and deep structure. Surface structure is going to be the ways that we combine symbols together, the physical words that we're looking at. What is it that we can observe or hear, or what's on the surface? So we can look at things like the syntax, our rules for combinations, and syntax is part of grammar. So how do we put things together? What words are we using? What order have they been put in? So that's our surface structure. That's the physical thing. We also have deep structure, and this is that underlying meaning of that combination. And this would involve our semantics because it's meaning. So how are we connecting these symbols? How are we assigning meaning to what we're talking about? And so a couple of examples here to help differentiate surface and deep. We can talk about two different sentences that have different surface structure, but the same deep structure. So we can say that Mary went to the zoo, or Mary visited the zoo. Both are basically saying the same thing, going to the zoo, but they're using different words to get that information across. So slightly different surface structures, identical deep structures. In contrast, we can have a single sentence, a single surface structure that has two or more deep structures. So this is when we run into things with ambiguous meaning. And if you're writing, this is a problem because it's sort of hard to interpret what it is exactly that you're saying. So I wrote down an example from a textbook that I've used because I always sort of falter trying to come up with a new one on the spot. But if we say that the police must stop drinking after midnight, so there's a couple of ways we can interpret that. We could say that the police should be doing their job and prevent people from drinking after midnight. Or maybe we're saying that the police themselves should not be drinking after midnight. So that is ambiguous meaning. That's having multiple deep structures, even from the same surface structure. So the words are the same, but the meaning can differ depending on interpretation. And so when we're having a conversation with someone, we actually use a little bit of both. Surface structure is listening to the words that someone's saying. Deep structure is us interpreting what it is that they're meaning by what they're saying. So we want to say, okay, we're having a physical conversation, you're getting this point across. And when you're formulating a response, you're usually going to be basing your response on their deep structure. What do they mean? And what are you going to say in return? And when you leave a situation, say after class, you're probably not going to have a memory of the surface structure of the lesson. You might not remember the exact words that were used in the exact order, but hopefully you'll have some kind of understanding of the deep structure. What is actually going on? What was the meaning behind this? What concepts did we talk about? What connections did we make? So you don't have to remember every single word, but as long as you get the meaning behind them, you're going to still understand and remember what happened. And so we're going to remember that deep structure a lot more than we will the surface structure. All right, and so our next couple of slides are all about the hierarchical structure of language. And I'm actually going to hop ahead and show you the hierarchy that I'm going to be talking about. So this slide shows us kind of like a pyramid. We're starting at the bottom with our small elements, and we combine them up to the top where we get a single larger element. And so we're going to be working from the bottom to the top in this hierarchy of smaller to larger sections. And so we're going to start with our phonemes, work up to morphemes and words and phrases and sentences. And the phonemes and morphemes, the two at the bottom, those are probably going to be the hardest to grasp just because you already have an understanding of words and phrases and sentences. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on the new concepts, but also then relate them into the stuff that you already know. So starting with our phonemes, these are our smallest units of sound that are recognized as separate. So these are the individual sounds, and they're not necessarily individual letters, because if you think about it, you can have different ways to pronounce the same letter. Maybe when you were learning to pronounce things, you'd look it up in a dictionary and you'd see different symbolic representations. Sometimes it's a hard A and sometimes it's a soft A. Those are two different phonemes, even if they're the same letter. So the phonemes relate to what they sound like, not the letters themselves. And we'll actually find in that chart showing that hierarchy at the bottom, those aren't necessarily letters. Sometimes they're also symbols that just denote different sounds. And so overall, humans can produce hundreds of different phonemes. And there's a lot of debate on the specific number, but no language is going to use all of them. We're each going to use a different subset of those sounds. And interestingly, when we're born, we're capable of producing all of these sounds. So when a younger child babbles, they can produce all of these different sounds. And yet when they get older, once we start learning a particular language, then we're going to lose those other sounds and will only produce the phonemes associated with the language that we speak. So we will eventually lose the production of most of them and stick to those phonemes exclusive to our language. And so in English, we have 44 or so phonemes. And other languages will have more or less. They can have as few as, I think, 15 or as many as 80. And the hard part when you're learning different languages is if that language uses sounds that you're not familiar with. You're not set up to listen for them. You're also not set up to produce them yourselves. You've kind of lost that flexibility in your vocal tract. And so it can be very difficult to learn to speak a language that you weren't taught from birth. And that's why you can usually identify a non-native language speaker by their accent, because there are certain sounds that don't exist in their sort of mother tongue that they have sort of trouble dealing with in the new language. All right, so those are our phonemes. Next, we're going to look at morphemes. So this is our next step up. And so morphemes are made up of combinations of phonemes. And so if phonemes are our specific individual sounds, morphemes are our smallest units of meaning. And so when we start combining, we're going to start seeing that generative property of language. So we go from our 44 English phonemes to more than 100,000 morphemes. So we're starting to get many of these. And so a little bit of confusion that I usually get with morphemes is some of them can be words. So smallest units of meaning, we could look at simple things like the word bat. That's a small mammal, I think. I think they're mammals, yeah. So that's a small, simple thing. We've made it by combining a bunch of sounds, a bunch of phonemes, and it's the smallest unit of meaning. So it is a word, but not all morphemes are words. Some morphemes are smaller than words. And that's where we have things like single letters or suffixes. I guess prefixes would count too. So if we add the letter S to the end of bat, we're changing the meaning. We're now saying that there isn't just one, now there are multiple. So by pluralizing it, we're giving meaning. So the letter S itself is its own morpheme because it has meaning in and of itself. If you add it to a word, you change the meaning of that word. Adding ED, we're saying that something happened in the past. So we're changing the meaning again. So that suffix would be its own morpheme. And so we can have sort of small subsets of sounds would be our sort of tail ends or prefixes that get added on. Small words can also be morphemes. So there's sort of a thing where words can be morphemes, but they can also be sort of combinations of multiple morphemes. And we'll look at some examples to help kind of clear that up a little bit, because I know that this part usually loses people. All right, and so we're going to combine these, again, following strict rules of how to combine them. Okay, and so like I said, some words are also morphemes, but there are morphemes that are not words. And there are words that consist of multiple morphemes. And we'll break that down. Actually, we'll do it right now, where if we hop onto this slide, we can look at our morphemes. So we're going to be looking at the two words, the players. The is a morpheme. That's very simple. It's a simple thing of meaning. We can't really change that. That's its own standalone. But if we look at players, play is a morpheme. That's the simplest form of the word. ER is telling us that it's the people who play. And then S tells us that there's multiple of them. So from that one word, players, we end up with 3 separate morphemes because we're modifying that root word play a couple of times. So we're combining multiple morphemes together to get those words. So this is what we mean by saying that, okay, so some words are made up of multiple morphemes, some words are single morphemes. And so that's how we can kind of differentiate the two. And we also want to keep in mind that some morphemes are not on their own enough to be a word. Sometimes they're just a prefix or a suffix, something that modifies that word. So that's our distinction between them. Okay, and then we move up into the stuff we're a lot more familiar with. Things like phrases, which is a conceptual unit. So it's a small group of words that's going to stand together as an idea or a concept. Then we have sentences, which is our final step in the hierarchy, and that's a combination of phrases. So again, we can go back to here. We had our words. We combine them into phrases. So the players would be one concept. And then talked to the fans is sort of another concept. And we can stick it together into a full sentence and say that the players talked to their fans. And we can keep going from there. Within a discourse, you can have sort of paragraphs and more if you're having written sort of communication. But this is sort of the only part that we really care about. So all the way down from our individual sounds that can be produced, all the way up to full sentences that can be put together. And we can start looking at this, like this is for spoken language, but you can do the same breakdown for signed language or written language or however you want to break things down. So with sign language, it would probably be for the phonemes. They might have different names for it, but it would be individual gestures that could be combined and then combined into the simplest units of meaning. And then phrase or words and then phrases and so on. So same basic concept. It's just a little bit easier to focus on spoken language because that's what we tend to deal with. All right, so our next section is to move on from our basic understanding of what language is and start talking about how we interpret and produce language. How do we actually understand what other people are telling us? And how do we decide how we're going to give information to others? And so this is another one of those points where a concept that I used to have to explain in quite a bit of depth is now nice and easy because we've talked about this before. This is that distinction between bottom-up and top-down processing. So with bottom-up processing, you're going to remember that individual elements of a stimulus get analyzed and combined to form a unified perception. So if you think about this, this is a lot more relevant for, say, learning a language. So think of a child who's learning to read. They're going to sit with their picture book and they're going to sound out each letter. And they're going to say the sounds together, and then it's going to sort of click that that is this word. It sounds like this word. I now know that word. And then they're going to sound out the next word, and then they can put those two words together. So they're starting at the bottom with each element, and they're assembling it together. And for us, we have bits of our brain that kind of process in this way. We've mentioned the fact that we have neurons that fire in response to very specific stimuli. So we have neurons that would fire for, say, a vertical line and a horizontal line. And so we could have an understanding or a breakdown of like the letter B. There's a vertical line for the spine and the horizontal lines for the sort of sticking out bits and then the rounded curves. So when we start, we would be interpreting sort of each of those stimuli all together and combining it into the letter B. But once we know about a language, once we've learned a language, we tend to rely a lot less on this bottom-up processing, and we tend to rely a lot more on top-down processing. And again, you'll remember top-down processing is when sensory information is interpreted in light of existing knowledge, concepts, ideas, and expectations. So we look at the big picture and we interpret it using information that we already have available to us. So this is really, really important for us. We rely very heavily on what are called mental sets. And these are kind of like a framework or a set of rules that sort of give us that expectation of how to interpret information. So a perceptual expectation that's especially useful when we're faced with things like ambiguous stimuli. So maybe someone introduces themselves, but you don't quite catch their name. But you can kind of figure out that, okay, well, it ended like this, and the first couple of letters might have been this or that. This is a more common name. Their name is probably this. I myself rely very heavily on that because I'm terrible at names. And I also do very poorly at listening to the start of sentences. So there's a lot of backfilling, using those mental sets to fill in some blanks. So like I said, language is very heavily top-down, especially once we understand it. Once we know this language, we're going to be relying on what we already know in order to use it. So we're interpreting things based on our pre-existing knowledge. We have a pre-existing vocabulary and grammar and rules. We can use it to fit in new information. So in a class like this, maybe you hear a word that you've never heard before. You understand every other word in the sentence, but not that one word. So maybe you infer the meaning of that one word from the context of the sentence. You can kind of fill in an element based on the big picture. So that's our top-down processing. And a big, big portion of this for us is speech segmentation. So for us, it's very difficult to tell the difference between individual sounds because all of our words are made up of those phonemes in different orders. So we have to rely on our knowledge, our base experience of language in order to figure out where should we be inserting breaks. Because I'm able to lecture to you, and you can understand that even though if we were looking at a spectrogram, which is a graph showing my sort of frequency and amplitude of my voice over time, it would look like a mess. There aren't a lot of breaks when someone is speaking. But you're able to interpret individual words, individual phrases, and sentences. And then from that, you can interpret meaning. So we're really good at speech segmentation. And interestingly, a lot of the time, say artificial intelligence, when they've set up things to try and do speech segmentation, they run into issues. And I've actually found the last 2 or 3 years have been a lot better. So you find that things like YouTube now does automatically generated subtitles. So I rely on that for a lot of my lectures, where when I post my recordings, YouTube does a very good job of figuring out what I'm saying and when I'm saying it. But say 5 or 10 years ago, and it was absolute garbage. It couldn't figure out if someone had even the slightest of accents. If someone spoke too quickly, it got very confused very quickly. And the reason for this is in human language, we don't have the same kind of, strictness with things like spaces between words. When I look at chickadee calls, I have sort of the note and then the gap between the note and then the next note. And that gap between notes is very consistent, usually pretty much identical plus or minus a few milliseconds. With humans, we sometimes find that within words, we have a larger pause than we do between words. And that's especially common for, I find for my own speaking. When I'm explaining things, I will slightly mispronounce a word so that it's easier to distinguish sort of two very similar sounding words. So when I was talking about monocular and binocular words or cues, I stress monocular and binocular. I'm inserting almost an artificial gap there, and I'm over-stressing the words so you can tell them apart. But if I'm talking about, monocular cues, the space between mon and ocular is the same, if not larger, than ocular and cues. So a computer would have a lot of trouble figuring out, is this one word, or is it like 3 words? Is it 2? But how is it 2? And so we're very, very good with our top-down processing, figuring out where to chop because we know which words we should be expecting, which ones tend to go together. And it's taken years and years and years of AI setups to figure out for computers where to put those same cuts. And humans are still a lot better at it than computers are, which you'll find if you watch sort of artificially generated YouTube subtitles, and you'll find that sometimes they go off the rails pretty quickly. But I find it very interesting to talk about that because that's been a problem for a very long time with computer modeling. All right, and then the last thing I wanted to talk about here is to sort of bring back the idea of social context of language. This is before we move on into some of our brain areas. So here, we've already kind of discussed this topic, but really didn't put a name to it. So the concept is pragmatics, and this is our knowledge of the practical aspects of using language. And this basically is focusing on the fact that our surface structure doesn't match our deep structure, and there are different contexts in which things aren't quite the same as the surface. So we use that idea of, with the test, I nailed it. And we know that because of the way that you're talking and who you're talking to, that you're using sort of an informal phrase to say that you did really well. That's a saying. It's a fairly common saying. We figured it out. Things like if you ask someone, do you have the time to explain this? Or do you have the time of day? One of them is asking, do you have some free time to sit down with me? And one of them is asking, what time is on your watch? So they're both very similar phrases, but they have very different meanings. So it's a lot more than just our vocabulary and the grammar to put those words in order to get the meaning. There's a lot more to it, and context, especially social context, is going to be a massive component. So because it's psychology and it's a Psych 104 course, we really care about the social side of things. But, oops, I did not mean to scroll there. But if we think of things like sarcasm, so the tone of voice can change the meaning of the words. So if your friend asked you how the test went and you sarcastically say, oh yeah, it was great, we know that you did very poorly on that test. Though the surface structure is telling us that it was great, but the meaning is different because of that tone. So we have sort of other factors that can be involved here. We also need to pay attention to things like who's talking and who are they talking to. So the interactions are going to matter. The relationships between people will matter as well. Sometimes groups of friends have their own shortcuts and their own phrases that have assumed meaning that don't necessarily mean anything to anyone else. So they can get meaning across within the friend group, but not outside of it. We also have to worry about things like, okay, are you talking to a parent or a supervisor, someone who has a different rank than you? Does that affect your tone? Does that affect your delivery? Are you more or less likely to use informal language? And so using the wrong tone, or say bringing in sarcasm or something like that when you shouldn't, would be violating those pragmatics. You're going against those unspoken rules of language. So there's lots and lots of things to consider here. And again, these are things that we do from as soon as we start learning language. We figure out that, you don't use that tone with your parents. Otherwise, it's disrespectful. But you can use that tone in other situations and it might be totally justified. So there's lots of other things to consider. All right, and then we're moving on into our specific areas of the brain. And again, this is really nice because we've talked about different areas of the brain in this class. So instead of me asking you to remember back to a previous semester, I can just say, hey, remember a few chapters ago. But we're going to be focusing in mainly on the areas that we've already talked about as they relate to language. So we can look at Wernicke's area, the blue spot right in the middle, and that's on our temporal lobe. And that's related to speech understanding. It's also going to be really close to where our auditory information is processed. Our primary and secondary auditory processing areas are also in that temporal lobe. And so they can pass information there. So we can have visual information from the occipital lobe just behind it. We have our auditory information coming through there as well. So we're able to use our Wernicke's area for spoken or written or signed speech, or signed language, whichever we want to talk about. And then the information from that Wernicke's area, when we're understanding and comprehending that information, we're going to go from that surface structure to the deep structure. What do they mean? And usually, while we're listening, we start formulating a response. So usually, you're having a conversation. Someone says something and is expecting a response. You're going to then formulate a response based on what they said. And we're going to use our Broca's area. That's involved in speech formation. And Broca's area is in that frontal lobe right next to our primary motor cortex. And our primary motor cortex controls all of our voluntary movements. So that would be what's involved in getting our mouths to make the right shape, getting our lungs to push out the right amount of air, modulating our vocal cords to get the right sounds. All of that would be run through our primary motor cortex. Interestingly, right near Broca's area is also where our hands are controlled. And they think that that's one of the reasons why so many people talk with their hands, because while you're formulating information, while you're getting ready to talk about it, it's also right next to the part that controls your hands. So it's very easy to do both at once. So a lot of people tend to gesture while they talk. And that's one of those things that I really missed with online learning. I would be sitting by myself in front of my computer recording a lecture, and I'd still gesture and point to things and do all sorts of stuff, but nobody saw it. So eventually I started using, I have a little pen tool, and I like to draw all over my slides. And that was a good enough stand-in. But it's amazing how much you miss when you lose those visual aspects. All right, and then the last thing I wanted to point out, so we've talked about our occipital lobe as our primary visual cortex. That's where our visual information is coming in. In individuals who are blind from birth, they don't have any incoming visual information because they cannot see. In those individuals, a lot of them end up actually having activity in their occipital lobe, specifically when they hear language. So that part of the brain ends up being co-opted and borrowed for auditory processing because it's not needed for visual processing. So it's kind of neat that we tend to see pretty consistent activity there in individuals who don't see, and specifically when they hear language, because that's such a big part of our lives. The note that I had left to myself was super cool, this fact, and I definitely agree with past me. All right. So the next, the next 4 or 5 slides are all about sex differences and which parts of the brain are involved and hemispheric lateralization. But I think what I want to do is leave it here, and we'll actually cover all of these together at once, as opposed to splitting us right in the middle of looking at these brain diagrams. That way we only have to figure them out the once. So we'll leave this here for now. As I said, we're going to do sort of Monday and Friday our lecture. Monday and Wednesday our lecture. Friday is the optional review session. I've already made that note on eClass, and then I'll send out an announcement a little bit later on once I have all the details finalized. But so I will see you guys on Wednesday.